I'm an 18-year-old female who grew up in Michigan and have lived in the country for as long as I can remember. On one particular hot summer weekend, me and a couple friends, including my boyfriend Tony and my older brother Brad, decided to go camping for the weekend since it was such a nice warm week. Tony's parents owned a cabin way out in Ludington surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But being stupid teenagers, we didn't really think about that. We were just ready to party like any normal teens would. There were 6 people in all. Me and Tony, my brother Brad, 1 other boy, and 2 other girls. After being there for about 2 hours, the fun really started. Tony's friends had brought enough alcohol and weed to last us the weekend, which we appreciated since we had no service and only movies to watch. By around 12 a.m. it was pitch black and we had a huge bonfire going. As we talked and laughed about upcoming events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't notice that my brother had frozen his eyes on one section of the woods. Mind you, we were all intoxicated and high at this time. Eventually our talking ceased when Tony finally realized that Brad had an expressionless face. "Hey dude, you all right?" he asked. Silence. Brad didn't reply or give any indication that he heard. He just continued staring. Then the other 2 girls and I started to get scared. It took a lot for my brother to act that way. Eventually I caught on that he was staring at a certain spot in the woods. I turned my head and followed his gaze as best I could. When I finally saw what he was staring at, my heart dropped. Right there was a dog. At least that's what it seemed like at first. It was some person's dog that had wandered off. That had to be it. But then my brain kicked in and I remembered that there were no neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? Where would it have come from? My mind started to race while Tony still tried to get Brad's attention. Then, in one motion, this thing stood up. Tall. And when I say tall, I mean gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet. Everyone noticed it then. How could you not? Tony's friends all gasped while my brother remained still as a stick. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Tony was the first to say something. "No tail," he mumbled. No one heard him except for Brad. And I swear it's true when I say his eyes went as big as saucers. That freaked me out even more than I already was. "What did you say?" one of the other girls asked. "It has no tail," Tony hissed at her. My heart stopped. He was right. There was no tail on this thing. My alcohol-clouded mind seemed to clear instantly when I finally realized what this thing was. Now I understood why my brother was basically shitting his pants. This thing was a Skinwalker. My instincts kicked in, and before I could nope the fuck out of there, this thing let out a terrible, rotting stench like rotten meat and an inhuman scream. The sound was enough to scare the crap out of everyone. My brother was the first to move. He started shouting native words to the creature, while I told everyone to get inside. Now! No one questioned me. They could see how dead serious I was, even Tony. He'd never seen me this scared, so he knew it was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin, with my brother still shouting native words at the creature. That seemed to keep it at bay and buy us enough time to get inside. Brad slammed the door and locked it before turning out all the lights, and grabbing a special ash from the kitchen counters, throwing it at every door and window while chanting. Of course, everyone was freaked out and basically in tears at this point. Once he was done, no one said a word for a long time. We were all still in shock. Finally, Brad grabbed our dad's pistol and sat posted by the door for hours. Everyone was too shaken up to even question what had happened. We must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to my brother packing all of our stuff into the 2 cars early the next morning. I understood why. We had native family. We'd heard the stories. We knew what we were dealing with and knew it would come back. Probably not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin and spoke a few calming words to my still very freaked out friends. We left as soon as everything was packed up. To this day, we still haven't explained to our friends exactly what happened that night, and they haven't bothered to ask. I bet there's a lot of you out there that love to go camping like me, right? Well, this story changed my view of camping forever. It started one hot summer with some friends on a camping trip in the woods of Florida. Yes, you can go camping in Florida. Anyway, the 5 of us reached the campground and were on the road to our site when we came across an entrance to a side road that was blocked off with a sign that said, "Stay away, no trespassing." I pointed the road out to my friends, but I should have known that was a mistake. They're the most curious people I've ever known. If you tell them not to go somewhere, they'll have to go check it out. Anyway, we arrived at our campsite, and as soon as we got off the truck, they insisted on investigating the closed-off area and wanted me to tag along. I didn't want to, but they convinced me it would be fun and exciting. And just my luck, they wanted to go after dark. Yay! So we ended up walking the dirt road from our site to the closed roadside and hiked in. I'm not sure what I expected to see, but all I noticed once entering the area were the trees. They seemed dry and white, like someone had sucked the life out of them. We kept walking and eventually came to an abandoned campsite. We checked to see if there were any goods we could take back to our own camp, but didn't find anything. Suddenly we heard a deep voice saying, "Get out now." We looked around, startled, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. We did have a flashlight with us, but what good was that if we didn't know where the idiot trying to scare us was hiding? Knowing we were in the wrong for trespassing, we left and tried to retrace our steps back to our campsite. But after several minutes, we realized we were walking in circles. Lost. I couldn't believe I'd let myself get lost with these idiots, but yeah, I did. Still wandering aimlessly, we heard another voice say, "We warned you." I was at my wit's end by this point. Damn, give us a chance to get out. We're lost here. Hello? Instead of giving us a damn warning, why don't you be useful and guide us out, fool? I shouted. I half expected an answer, but only silence filled the night. Disappointed, we kept walking for what seemed like hours, the 4 of us going nowhere. Wait, there were 5 of us on this trip. One of my friends had gone missing at some point. Frantic, we looked all over the place, but there was no sign of him. We shouted his name, no answer. We couldn't explain how he'd just disappeared, but he did. Then one of the other guys spoke up, saying he heard that people go missing from this area and are never seen again. Don't you think you should have told us that before we had to go out here exploring a restricted area? I shouted. I would seriously have to consider getting new friends if I made it out of this mess alive. He blubbered an apology, saying he thought it was just a story to keep people out. Then we noticed that in the span of our argument, another member of our group had gone missing. Now we were down to 3 people, and all I could think was that it was like we were in a bad Predator movie. We were being hunted. Then we heard yet another voice. "You can't escape from us." Chills went down my spine, and the remaining 3 of us started sprinting down the path. We had no idea which direction we were going, but what else could we do? We ran blindly until we hit a dead end with those trees in the way. Those ugly, dried-up white trees. We stood panting, utterly defeated. But then I saw something move out of the corner of my eye on one of the trees. I stepped closer to get a better look, and an eye stared back at me. The tree had eyes. I jumped back, screaming. The reaction from my friends told me they'd seen it as well. We ran back to the deserted campsite. It was the only thing we could think to do, at least until we figure out what to do about the trees. Living trees. No, the abandoned campsite didn't seem any safer, but I didn't care. I just wanted away from those things. We made it back to the abandoned campsite, but by then the night was getting colder. I hunted through my pockets and found a box of matches. Maybe our only stroke of luck since coming here. I pulled out a match and started it to build a fire. Then I heard a loud screaming from all around us. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" So, they didn't like fire. My friends and I shared a look that said we were all thinking the same thing. We started piling fresh sticks onto the burned-out campfire and lit it. The screams that echoed around us. It was like being in a stadium full of demons screaming in agony. My friends and I each took a lit branch from the fire. We figured we should try to head back on the dirt road and see if those trees would move. If they didn't, well, we could always burn them. When we reached the dead-end path, I shit you not, the trees parted out of our way. We took the opportunity to run, and didn't stop running until we made it back to the campsite, and our truck. We left that night. We didn't care how late it was. I know for a fact that no one would ever believe us, but I'm glad to be alive and to have escaped. My name's Jake. I'm 22 years old and currently attending Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina. In celebration of our last year at uni before graduation, my friends and I planned a camping trip for the last week of school. The hardest part was fitting everyone in my Jeep, but we managed. "What the hell is that, Chase?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "A blunt. Duh." Chase was the stoner of our group, because every group just has to have one. He was a chubby little white boy, about 5'8", with brown hair pulled up in a bun and just enough chin hair to look like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. "Damn it, you're not going to hotbox my car," I exclaimed. I would shake my head in disbelief if I wasn't so used to it. "I agree with Jakey. At least save it for when we get there," Blair chimed in. Blair was the most cheerful one in our group, at least around me. She was about 5'6", with fair skin, long red hair, light freckles across the bridge of her nose, and bright green eyes. "Thanks, Blair," I said, with a sigh of relief. She smiled at me and went back to playing whatever choose-your-own-adventure game she'd recently installed on her tablet. We didn't even make it 5 minutes without another argument breaking out in my back seat. I let out another sigh. It was going to be a long week. When we arrived at the forest, I made sure to do a head count in case we lost anyone at a rest stop. Okay, there's Blair and Chase, staying as far away from each other as possible. There's Aljo. Aljo was a really muscular guy with dark skin who stood around 6'2", with a dark high-top hairstyle and a well-maintained beard. And there's Corey, by far the nicest person in our group. Corey was only about 5'3", with caramel-colored skin and curly brown hair that framed her face. "So, Jake, what are we waiting for?" she said, in a sweet voice. "Let's go enjoy the great outdoors." I half expected her to end up singing to the little woodland creatures along the way. There's no point in delaying it any longer, I guess. While we were scouting out the forest for a good campsite, I felt strangely calm. There's just something about being in the woods that feels so serene. The birds singing their sweet songs and the sunlight reflecting through the blades of dew on the leaves is just relaxing. My moment of peace was interrupted, however. Something was off. It was just enough for you to notice, but not enough to pinpoint what it was. I stopped walking and concentrated on finding the source of my unease. After a few moments, my ears caught it. One bird was out of sync with the others. All the others were singing almost in perfect unison, but it was as if this little guy was half a beat behind the song they all sang. No one else seemed to notice it, so I just kept walking. It was a bit weird, but oh well. Maybe it was a little young bird and he was just learning to sing after all. When we finally found a site we could all agree on, it was almost dark. Chase and Corey started building a campfire, while Blair, Aljo, and I began assembling the tents. "So, Jake," Aljo began, "you brought the arrows, right?" "Of course I did. You bring the bow?" I responded. Instead of responding, he simply tossed the bow my way. I grabbed it and tested the drawstring. It felt nice and strong, tight but reflexive. It was a beautiful maple wood bow, gifted to Aljo by the Navajo tribe we'd met a few years back in Utah. I set it down near his tent and got to work helping Blair set up ours. "Here, let me get that for you," I said, hammering a tent spike down. "Thanks, Jakey," she said with a smile. "I'll go get our bags." Before she could take a step toward the car, Chase showed up in front of her. "I'll go with you then," he said with a creepy wink. He has a really punchable face, I thought. "How about you just go get them by yourself, then?" Blair retorted with a wink of her own. Chase sighed in defeat and started off toward the car. While Chase was getting our bags, the rest of us sat around the campfire. Corey was talking to Aljo, with a bright smile on her face, as usual. I heard something about it being a nice night for s'mores before I was reminded of the redhead sitting next to me. "So, Jakey, you ready to spend the whole week with us?" Blair asked playfully. She said us, but I knew she was more asking if I was ready to spend the week with her. There's no one I'd rather be stuck with, I replied with a wink. Her eyes lit up and her smile grew wider, making me wonder what I'd just gotten myself into. She grabbed my wrist and yanked me toward her tent. Blair, you sure this is the best time for this? I asked hesitantly. Oh, shut up, Jakey. She pulled me into the tent and zipped away my view of Aljo giving me a thumbs up and Corey just staring, innocently wondering what was happening. I turned around to find Blair, tablet in hand. She held it out to me and told me to choose a game. Well, this isn't what I thought was going to happen. I tapped the one called Not Much Time and sat down on the tent floor. She sat next to me with her head on my shoulder, and we alternated game choices. When I woke up, I could see rays of sunlight peeking through the small holes in my tent. My right arm was still asleep, so I went to move it, but couldn't. I looked over to find Blair hugging my arm like a teddy bear. I let out a sigh and gently freed myself from her death grip. I noticed the dead tablet on the floor and plugged it into a portable charger. I unzipped the tent and went out into the fresh pine-scented air. I thought I was the first one awake, but that thought was shattered when I noticed smoke coming from Chase's tent. Really? This early in the morning? I relit our campfire and boiled water for some oatmeal. I made sure I had enough for everyone and poured in the packets. In a few minutes, I had 2 bowls of oatmeal and headed back to Blair's tent. Hey, Blair, I made breakfast. She was still asleep. Hey, dummy, I got you something, I said as I nudged her with my foot. She whined about not wanting to go to school today and tried to go back to sleep. I sighed and put the bowl down in front of her face, and, like a dog, she sniffed a little and opened her eyes. Oh, hey, Jakey, she said, and I rolled my eyes. I sat down next to her and ate my oatmeal. I guess it could be worse. Throughout the day, we each did various chores around the camp. Blair and Corey decorated everyone's tents, Chase got wood for the fire, and Aljo and I went hunting. Aljo was more familiar with the bow than I was, so I had my knife. A 6-inch bowie, made for an easy kill up close, and Aljo was our ranged guy. So far, all we had seen were rabbits and deer tracks, but neither of the animals that had left them. So we set up some snares for rabbits and decided it would be best to set up a post in a tree and let the deer come to us. We found a decent-sized tree and climbed up to wait in the branches. While we waited on our prey, Aljo was dead silent. I felt calm and focused, like I was born to be on the hunt. But that feeling was shattered, leaving unease in its wake. My eyes scoured the forest for something, anything out of place. That's when I saw it. A single deer grazing on the dew-covered grass. As it made its way from one patch of grass to another, I studied it for abnormalities. The problem was easy to identify. The deer was walking differently from any deer I'd ever seen. Its steps were jerky, uncertain almost, as if it thought the floor might give out from underneath it. It would tap the ground with its front hoof in one spot, then stamp the same hoof down a few times from where it tapped. As it did this, it was making a noise. It almost sounded like a low growl. Now, maybe there was an explanation for its lurching steps, but deer don't growl. As I thought this, the deer's head suddenly jerked up toward me and Aljo. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart lurched violently as the deer stopped. The deer, or whatever it was now gazing into my very soul, with bright yellow eyes. I couldn't bring myself to look away, at least until Aljo fired an arrow into the damn thing. It let out the most blood-curdling screech I've ever heard. Then it took off into the bushes, and we got the hell out of that tree. That night, we were all chilling by the campfire, eating more s'mores. Corey and Aljo were talking again and seemed to really be hitting it off. I smiled at the thought of 2 of my best friends being happy together. They certainly deserved it. Chase had gone into the woods to take a leak and should be back any time now. And then I started thinking about that deer again. What was that thing? It couldn't have just been a deer. But surely it's gone by now and we were all safe. I was broken out of my thoughts by a small hand gripping mine. I looked to find Blair smiling at me. What you thinking about, Jakey? She asked in her usual playful tone. Just about how good these s'mores are, I said, with excitement. Thanks for bringing the chocolate. She laughed and punched my arm. "You're a bad liar, you know," she teased me. "No, really, these are great," I replied in between bites. She laughed again and rested her head on my shoulder. We were all laughing about some embarrassing memories of Chase when we heard that ear-piercing screech. My heart threatened to jump out of my chest and into the fire. It was that same screech the deer had made earlier that day. Aljo and I shared a glance and jumped into action. I grabbed my knife, he grabbed his bow and quiver. We were just about to head out to find Chase when Blair grabbed my hand and looked me in the eyes. She didn't need to say anything for me to know she was scared. I looked over at Aljo and received only a nod in response. He headed out, and I sat back down with Blair and Corey. He was capable of handling himself, and I couldn't just leave Blair and Corey defenseless. I gripped my knife tighter as the minutes turned into hours, waiting for Chase and Aljo to return. Blair tried to calm me down and assured me everything would be okay, but I knew neither of us really believed that. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Chase finally walked back into camp. I jumped up and rushed toward him. He looked toward me and my steps faltered. For a split second, I thought I saw yellow eyes staring at me. But I blinked and they were back to his normal stormy gray. I was going crazy, right? I thought to myself. "Where have you been?" I shouted instead, in a more panicked tone than I meant to use. "Taking a leak," he said. I thought there was something off about his voice, but it was back to normal so quick that I just brushed it off as me going crazy again. Blair came over to my side and asked Chase some questions, but he seemed to be normal Chase. Corey, however, stayed by the now-dying campfire. "Where's Aljo?" she asked, fear weighing heavily in her voice. "I don't know," Chase responded, with that weird tone again. I made a mental note to remember that tone shift. Corey took a stumbling step backwards. "I don't believe you," she screamed at him. This wasn't like her at all. What had happened to the sweet girl who was always smiling? Chase took a lurching step toward her, and I instinctively moved in between them, gripping my knife with white knuckles. I'd seen that type of movement before. He looked me up and down and walked to his tent. Something was very wrong. Blair and I spent the rest of the day trying to comfort Corey in any way we could think of. We made her some more s'mores, gave her a shoulder massage, played games with her on Blair's tablet, but none of it worked. She just kept insisting that I go look for Aljo. I wanted to, I really did, but I couldn't leave them with Chase. There was something off about him, and I didn't think I could trust him. It was still night, and Blair was cooking rabbit over a fire. Then as it neared morning, the sky turned a deep pink, the clouds looked blue against it, making it look like a giant sheet of cotton candy. When Blair was done, I walked to the door of Chase's tent and reluctantly called out, "Hey, food's ready." No response. I tried again. Still no response. My patience was wearing thin, so I unzipped the door of his tent. I looked inside and was surprised at what I found. Or rather, what I didn't find. Chase was gone, and there was a huge hole in the back of the tent. I suddenly lost my appetite. The girls ate, and then we all decided to catch up on some sleep and wait for Aljo and Chase to come back. Blair and I went to our tent and Corey to hers. We zipped shut the door and crawled into our sleeping bags. Blair snuggled up next to me, and I drifted asleep. I was woken by a sound of a screech that sent a shiver down my spine and chilled my blood. I bolted upright and unzipped the tent door, rushing out into the cold night air. The moon was like a glacier gleaming as rays of sunlight danced through its icy core. I could see clearly in the night, even without a fire, and I rushed over to Corey's tent to see if she was all right. What I found made me almost collapse. Her tent was empty, and in the back was a gaping hole, exposing the forest on the other side. I found my knife and sheathed it at my hip. I made to leave and go look for Corey, but Blair stepped in front of me. "You're not going alone. I'm coming with you," she said. I told her to stay close to me, and we started off into the forest. My heart was racing inside my chest, every instinct telling me to get out and escape this damn forest. I dashed through the brush on the forest floor, running for my goddamn life. Suddenly I noticed Blair was no longer running with me. As much as I willed myself to go back and look for her, my body didn't stop running. I was in fight or flight mode, and I'd subconsciously chosen flight. I kept running until I came face to face with Aljo. I felt relieved at first until I realized he wasn't blinking. In fact, he had no eyes. Oh God, his cheeks were torn into a permanent smile. His eyeballs gouged out, his ears ripped off, leaving only bloody holes on the side of his head. I looked down at his body. His chest had been torn open, exposing the rib cage underneath. His gut open, his innards spilling out like a never-ending rope. I turned to my left to run, but was met with Chase's body, in a similar state to Aljo. I stumbled backwards and turned to run the other way, but found Corey. What was done to her I won't describe. I already have to see it every night in my nightmares. I crumbled to my knees and threw up what little I had left in my stomach. That's when I heard a familiar voice. "Aw, Jakey, you almost got away." I tried to crawl away, but was kicked hard in the ribs. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, begging for mercy. Blair slammed a knee down into my chest and thrust an arrow right through my cheek. I howled in pain as blood flowed down my throat. My lungs burned for oxygen as I began to drown in my own blood. Blair saw what was happening and gripped the arrow in my cheek, using it to turn me onto my side. Clearly, she didn't want me to die just yet. She wanted to make me suffer. She tore the arrow from my face, leaving a bloody hole. She rolled me onto my back again and plunged the arrow into my chest and into my gut. She stabbed me over and over until she could freely peel the skin off, leaving only exposed muscle. She stuck the arrow into my eye and began clawing at my exposed muscles. Every second was enough pain to make me wish I was dead. I was losing focus, clearly on the verge of passing out, but I just needed to grab the knife. She grabbed the arrow again and carved the Navajo word for property right into my stomach. I felt the cold handle of my blade and gripped it tight. I brought it up to her eye and dragged it down the side of her face. She recoiled off me and let out that all-too-familiar screech and took off into the night before everything went black. I woke up in the hospital a few days later. Apparently some other campers had found me not long after I passed out, unconscious from blood loss. They had me helicoptered to the nearest hospital. The doctors began surgery right away and miraculously saved my life. You can't trust anyone. I learned that the hard way. Once you trust someone, you become their property. I know because these scars will never fade, or the memories, or the pain, and I will always be that thing's property.